I've been the first half of the show, George Lincoln Rockwell won. Now this is the second half, and going to start out with a note by Dr. William Pierce on George Lincoln Rockwell. He said, I first contacted George Lincoln Rockwell in 1964, same time I was volunteering for Vietnam. At that time, I was teaching physics at the Oregon State University, and I was beginning to wonder what in the world was going on as the turmoil and chaos known today as the civil rights revolution got underway. I didn't quite know what to make of it when my Jewish colleagues would ask me to sign petitions demanding that the university hire black faculty members and recruit black students. Then one day I saw a short television news segment of Rockwell trying to speak to a group of students at a university in California, while Jews in the audience screamed at him and threw bottles and stones. I heard only about 2 sentences of Rockwell's speech, and then the Jews rushed onto the stage and ripped loose the cable from his microphone. That evening I hunted up Rockwell's address in the library and wrote him a letter. Now, folks, I was in a presidential campaign in 1996 with Charles Collins, and they did that exact same thing at the Republican conventions. They went and unplugged his microphones so no one could hear him tell you the truth about the banksters and that we could print our own money the same way Kennedy did it with Executive Order 1110. They unplugged his microphone in Maine, and so what I did was I went out and made copies of his speech and passed it out to everyone in Maine to get his message out. I was able to do that because I wrote his speech for him. It was on my computer. Now, William Pierce, who I interviewed back when I was on shortwave, he said he hunted up Rockwell's address, wrote him a letter. 2 years later, our correspondence had grown into full-time collaboration on my first magazine, National Socialist World, and the year after that, Rockwell was gunned down by a hate-crazed assassin. In 1964, when our relationship began, Rockwell was a 46-year-old publisher of a monthly newsletter he called the Rockwell Report, and the leader of the American Nazi Party, a small group in Arlington, Virginia. In early 1966, shortly before I moved to Virginia and began publishing National Socialist World, he reorganized his group as the National Socialist White People's Party. He had been a philosophy student at Brown University in Providence. Matter of fact, that's where Charles Collins, one of the places we went. And Rockwell was a philosophy student at Brown before the Second World War. After war broke out in Europe, he joined the Navy, became a naval aviator, and rose to the rank of commander. After the war, he studied art, began a small advertising agency when he became concerned 5 or 6 years before I did about the growing influence of communist ideas and policies in America. He associated himself briefly with various groups and individuals having a conservative, patriotic orientation. All of these were afraid to deal openly and forthrightly with the 2 issues that Rockwell soon came to realize were at the core of the problem: race and the Jews. Anti-communism wasn't enough, he decided. One must not only attack the symptoms of the disease, but its cause. One must expose the Jews as bearers of the communist virus, and one must understand that the danger posed by the Jews is not that they generally favor leftist economic and social policies, but that they aim at destroying us through racial mixing. In 1959, by 1959, he concluded that the national conservatism was more of an impediment than an aid to the struggle against the Jews, and he declared himself a National Socialist. Actually, he declared himself a Nazi, began wearing a uniform with a swastika armband, and greeted his followers with the Roman salute and a Heil Hitler. This touch of Hollywood and Rockwell's approach to revolutionary politics was always a bone of contention between him and me. I argued that the uniforms, flags, and theatrical behavior, and even the name American Nazi Party, made it difficult for serious people to take him seriously. His medium got in the way of the message. He replied that if he put away the flags and armbands, wore a business suit, and shunned theatrics, the news media would ignore him and no one would hear what he had to say. His aim, he said, was to make people pay attention to his simple core message of the need of rebuilding a white, Jew-free America based on the principles laid down by Adolf Hitler and Mein Kampf. When he tried to present that message in a sober, serious way, nobody paid any attention to him. The newspaper and television stations wouldn't send reporters to his press conferences. They ignored his press releases, and the public didn't even know that he existed. But as soon as he raised the swastika banner, the news media went crazy and swarmed all over him. He was seen on the TV channels, and what he said was reported in the newspapers. Yes, I answered. The theatrics get attention for you, but your message gets badly distorted. The media try to make you look like a madman and a clown, and to a large extent they succeeded. The result is that most of the people attracted to you are losers, social outcasts, freaks, and if you want to attract winners, serious, competent, idealistic people, you need a serious image. Rockwell responded that it is the losers, the social outcasts, who make up the ranks of every revolutionary movement. They're the ones who are available, the ones who don't have anything to lose by becoming associated with a politically incorrect cause. Individually, they may not be very impressive, but large numbers of them, organized and disciplined, would make a revolutionary army. He had tried appealing to what I call the winners, to the teachers and the professors, to the doctors and lawyers and engineers, to the writers and artists, and to the businessmen and craftsmen, to his fellow military officers, to the careful, responsible men and women that with steady employment, stable families. And he had found that while many of them agreed with him in principle, almost none had the moral courage to stand up and be counted among the righteous. He had given speeches to groups of these people under the cover of several ostensibly conservative organizations. They would come up after his speeches, shake his hand, and tell him they admired him for saying what they also felt, but the mere suggestion from Rockwell to one of these people that he ought to participate in an effort to take America back from the Jews and their collaborators would send the fellow scurrying away in fright. They were too comfortable, too corrupted by good living and materialism, too unaccustomed to taking risk and facing opposition. Only in the masses, Rockwell had finally concluded, were the results to be found that he needed to launch a political campaign to take America back, and the masses could only be reached through the news media. I still had serious doubts about whether the type of people Rockwell was attracting with his flamboyant tactics could be disciplined and used to build an effective organization, and these doubts may be held back from a wholehearted support of his efforts. We collaborated on the publishing of National Socialist World, and we continued to argue about many other things. I gradually found out, however, that Rockwell was dead right about the moral cowardice and servile conventionality of the great majority of Americans. Most of them would rather lose an arm and a leg than to be suspected of thinking a politically incorrect thought. And as I worked and argued with Rockwell, my appreciation of his own courage and idealism grew. He was a man with several talents, any of which could have earned a comfortable living for him, but he was one of those rare individuals who is wholly in contact with reality, who wholly identifies with the world around him, and who therefore is incapable of ignoring what he recognizes as wrong. To Rockwell, evil must be opposed and good must be upheld. To pretend that the world is other than it is was self-defeating. To lie about it or try to fool others about it was unthinkable. Once his eyes were open to the Jews and what their policies were doing to America, there was no question of keeping his mouth shut and going on about his business. He had to speak out against them. He had to fight them. He would fight them anywhere, anytime, under any conditions, no matter what the odds. He would fight them with all the strength of his being. I'm sure if there had been 1,000 men, just 1,000 men like Rockwell in America in 1966, we'd be living in a healthy, progressive, all-white America today. Like all of us, Rockwell had shortcomings, of course. Sometimes made mistakes. He was sometimes mistaken in his facts. He thought Pablo Picasso was a Jew, for example. He sometimes misjudged character in people. He had a tendency to oversimplify things, and I'm convinced more than ever that both his theatrical tactics and his strategy of trying to persuade the masses before recruiting an elite cadre and building a strong infrastructure were unsound. His evaluations of the basic moral health of America and the intelligence and character of the American people were far too optimistic. He really believed in 1966 that the Jews and their collaborators could be beaten by 1972. His optimism fueled his activity, and he eagerly sought opportunities to carry his message to anyone who would listen. Here's an introduction to Rockwell at the Brown University.
I'm William Pierce. I first contacted George Lincoln Rockwell in 1964. At the time, I was teaching physics at Oregon State University, and I was beginning to wonder what in the world was going on as the turmoil and chaos known today as the Civil Rights Revolution.
I've already read that. And so let's
racially pure. Well, now, up to this point, I'll back the right of the Jews to write this. Everybody has a right to say this is a vile book and you shouldn't read it, or we don't like it. And I'd fight for anybody's right to do that. But that's not what they did. Listen to what they did to that book. We are interested in stifling the sale of this book. And they did, ladies and gentlemen. You can't get it except that it's a rare book. You won't find The Conquest of a Continent.
This is George Lincoln Rockwell at UCLA. This is the second half of the bit that I did on the first show. This is the second half of George Lincoln Rockwell speaking at UCLA, 5/16/67. Got it back at the right spot here.
Better, and if there's anything awful, it's a white Southern Christian Protestant. He's no good. This is the only side you ever see. You never see the other side because of this book stifling. And listen how they do it here. We believe that this stifling can best be accomplished by refusing to be stampeded into giving the book any publicity at all. Every review or even every public criticism of the book of this character brings it to the attention of many who would otherwise never know of the existence of the book. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I've written a book, and maybe it's the worst book in the world. Maybe it really is. But don't you think you ought to have a chance to know that? Do you think the Jews, as they have, should make it impossible for you to pick that book up in a bookstore and look at it and say, that stinks and I won't buy it? You ought to have that right. You do have that right by the American Constitution to judge for yourselves what you want to read. The Jews have taken it away from you. They stifle books. Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of books are not allowed to be published Because the Jewish businessmen, who are geniuses, I won't deny that, have risen to the top, and I won't deny their right to do that, but then they've abused their power. They've got enormous power of wealth, and they use this power of wealth to tell anybody, any bookseller, if you carry George Lincoln Rockwell's book, you can't get any other books to sell. Who's going to go out of business to sell my one book, or The Conquest of a Continent, or any other book? George Wallace wrote a book. I think he'd have a hard time getting into a lot of bookstores. Maybe you hate George Wallace. Well, if Gus Hall wrote a book, let's use the other side. I think Gus Hall's book should be available so you can pick it up and decide. These Jews don't have the right to tell you you can't read what they don't like, and they do it. And that's what I'm here tonight to tell you. And in order to do it, I have to face force, violence, arrest, all sorts of harassments that the same people that are doing this don't do to the Vietnam Protest Committee. They don't do it to the flag burners. They just do it to anti-communists. I understand poor Mr. Welch is going to speak here tomorrow. And God help him. This could be a very wild and woolly audience with Mr. Welch, because he's not rough and tough. I gave up being a conservative years ago because I discovered you can't fight these people nice. They're not nice. They yell MFer at you. And out in the street, I just soon yell it right back and do more than that besides. Anybody who wants to punch me in the nose, the only way to deal with him is punch him harder until he understands that you're not going to tolerate any more this punching. And if you don't do that, he's going to stomp you. In World War II, ladies and gentlemen, I was taught to hate. If hate is a bad thing, then Franklin D. Roosevelt is the wickedest man in history, because he taught millions of Americans to hate Germans and to hate Japs, and we did. And we beat the hell out of them because we hated them. We killed them as fast as we could. I was one of them. Now, ladies and gentlemen, the enemy is communism, and they're preaching love. That's all you hear from these lovely people, these standees here. Love. And you're getting whipped. Purpose of preaching hate in that war was because the enemy then had his finger on communism. So they taught you to hate him and kill him. Now the enemy, or so-called enemy we're supposed to have as an enemy, which we won't even declare in the Congress, is communism, and they're preaching love and coexistence. Can't you see the picture? Just like the book stifling. In one instance, they preach hate and fight, and we won. Now they want us to lose, and they're preaching love, and we're losing. How stupid can the American people be, and how long will they continue it? And I maintain all it will take to wake them up is what you good people are allowing me to do tonight. Let people tell you the truth and let you judge it for yourselves. The people are smart enough to figure it out. The minute you let them see these stifled books, they'll see there's another side. The minute they hear these stifled speakers like myself, they'll see that I'm not a raging lunatic. They'll see that I've got some facts behind it. Well, let me ask you something, ladies. Well, I won't put it in the form of a question. I'll make it a statement. I have tonight, I have done a psychological trick to you. You may call it a dirty trick. I think it's a good thing to have done. I have now set every one of you in this audience so you have changed forever, whether you realize it or not. I'm going to point out how. When I got back from World War II, thinking that I had saved the world from any more terrorism and tyranny and so forth, since then there's been 18 people convicted of treason to this great country. 17 of them have been Jews like the Rosenbergs, Harry Gold, Brothman, Moskowitz, Harry Gold, and the whole parade of Jews. After this speech tonight, ladies and gentlemen, you know what's going to happen to you as has happened to me once? From now on, whenever they haul out one of these little communist spies, you'll notice the length of the nose. You'll never forget it. When they tell you that the names of the New English spies are the Krogers, you'll notice that it says in the paper in parenthesis, Cohens. You'll notice that when it says up in Canada they catch Harry Rose and Sam Carr as the leaders of communism in Canada, it turns out Rose's name is Rosenberg and Carr's real name is Cohen. Just like Litvinov and Trotsky, they changed their names. But you'll notice it from now on. You can't help it. And ladies and gentlemen, once you notice the truth, you never can forget it. It's possible to convert from a lie to the truth. But I never heard of anybody, once having found the truth, going back to a lie. You'll never do it. No matter what you think of me tonight, no matter what you think of this speech, from now on you'll start noticing every time you see a communist group, you will begin to notice what the leaders look like and who they are. And you will discover they're members of the tribe. Who do you think is the head of a communist organization in this country that is so red, so leftist, and so traitorous that they call the Communist Party of Gus Hall a bunch of squares? Progressive Labor is the real, red-hot communist organization in this country, and the leader of it is a man named Jake Rosen. Does that sound Swedish to you? Every time I look around, wherever you go, wherever these communist operations are going, here are these Jewish people leading them. Now, those Jews are in the audience who are saying, oh, Rockwell, you ought to die, instead of cussing me for telling the audience this, you ought to be saying those Jews are traitors to our race. If there's loyal Jews in this audience, and I'm sure there are, you should be deploring this, as good Italians deplore the mafia. You don't get punched in the nose for saying the mafia is Sicilian. It is. But you do get punched in the nose by these Jews for saying communism is Jewish. It is. I'm not saying all Jews are communists or all communists are Jews. That would be wicked and stupid. Just as it would be stupid to say, because the mafia is Sicilian, it would be stupid and wicked to say all Sicilians are gangsters, or all gangsters are Sicilians. But you all still know, in spite of those facts being true, it's still true that the mafia is a Sicilian operation. Communism, from Karl Marx, who was a Jew, Engels, Lassalle, right straight through all of these people that I've read, all through our spies now, right up to Leo Rosen, is a Jewish operation. And ladies and gentlemen, if you don't know that, you are not going to be able to deal with it realistically. You can't. Because the Jews will just be able to stifle everything about it that they don't want you to hear. And that's what's happened to me, ladies. What happened to me, they say I'm a hater and a bigot. Well, I don't see how it's bigotry when I find out that they've lied to me and I don't like it. Let me ask you this, ladies and gentlemen. Have you heard in your history courses in college or high school, did anybody ever mention the possibility that the Russian Revolution wasn't Russian, that it was Jewish? Maybe it's not true, but don't you think that such a strong possibility should be mentioned to you so you could think about it? But they cover it up. If you mention it every once in a while when I'm at a college and there's a history professor up here, I ask them, why don't you mention that? And if they try to deny it, I beat them down with the facts. But they don't do it in the classroom. They don't tell you. It's not in your textbooks. And I think that's wrong. And incidentally, ladies and gentlemen, if you want it specially, when you send away, we put out a special reader's guide of suppressed books. Ask for it and have a ball. Watch the Jews suffer. Now, ladies and gentlemen, let me show you. I'm going to wind this up by showing you what this is leading to, what is happening to your country. I haven't got half the time. I'd like to give you the total picture of all the horrors that this has led up to, but I haven't got the time. I can only tell you that they have lied to you so much that when you start hearing what's actually and really happening in your country, you know what I usually find in most audiences? They giggle. I'm going to give you an example. See, drop down here. I want to show you something that should shock you. You should just almost be panic-stricken, because when you finally realize the import of this thing, you will be. And I get many letters from every audience that they are. But usually when I first show this little exhibit to an audience, they titter, because it just doesn't seem possible. And I agree with you. But it's true. Now I'm going to show you this document here. This is the thing called the Crusader, put out in Cuba by a man named Robert Williams, the ex-head of the NAACP in Monroe, North Carolina. He led an armed rebellion down there. He kidnapped a white couple, and he fled to Cuba for refuge, from where he runs a thing curiously called Radio Free Dixie, broadcasting to the Negroes on how to make bombs and so forth. Now, this booklet here that I have was published before the rioting in Watts. And ladies and gentlemen, this is available from us in the packet. You read it and decide for yourselves, ladies and gentlemen, if this is not the blueprint for Watts and Cleveland and Chicago. Here it all is, tells them exactly what to do. You know what the most important thing he says to do is? He says you got to keep practicing the way they are, a little here and a little there, for the day when you can strike with Mau terrorism all over the United States. And to do it, he says you've got to have one element that will absolutely destroy the white man. He says the white man has become soft. And I think he's right about this. I think the Negroes in the ghetto are tough. They're forced to do degrading, menial, hard physical labor. And they're in good, tough physical shape. Every time I go to jail, it's hard to survive. They're rough. And when I go out on the streets and I see these guys with their hair in their eyes all slinking around, a bunch of Peace Creek white guys, they look like girls. And they think it's bad and naughty to fight. They're ashamed to fight. They're scared to fight. Negroes aren't scared. They're not scared of knives. They're not scared of any kind of violence, because every Friday and Saturday night they cut each other up for practice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this guy puts this thing out, and you know what he says is necessary to completely terrorize all you white people? He says you depend on technocracy, on all your technology, most of all on electricity. All over the Congo, all over the Portuguese Angola, wherever the terrorists tried to take over, the first thing they tried to get were the power stations. Because if they could black out a place in the night, in the darkness, the terror would be complete. It would be impossible to fight them. We would be shooting our own people. This was the technique. Black the place out. Now, let me tell you something amazing about this book, The Crusader. It comes out every month or so by this guy Williams. He can't get it directly into the United States, so he sends it through Canada. And on the back here, it tells where you can get it, this little magazine here, in Canada. You can get it through Mrs. Ann, remember this name, Mrs. Ann Olson, 21 Ellis Gardens, Toronto 3, Ontario, Canada. This is where you can get this booklet telling about how to terrorize the white people by shutting off the electricity. Do you know where Mr. Olson works? Sir Adam Beck Power Plant, where the power failed and blacked out almost a quarter of the United States and all the northeastern section of Canada. I'm aware that this is a hard thing to believe. Right after it happened in the Northeast, it happened in the Southeast, it happened in the Northwest, it's happened all over the country. They're just checking to be sure they can do it, and they can. Ho, 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 ho. Well, those of you who are ho-ho-hoing, I think you'll find a lot of the audience are doing a little studying, and when they get done, they'll be wondering why you guys are ho-ho-hoing, just like me. This has happened in country after country all over the world, and you know what they're doing? The main element that they have to do in order to pull off this terrorism, the first thing they got to, I hate to sound like a bircher, but I'm going to have to. The first thing that's necessary in order to pull off their terrorism, ladies and gentlemen, is to destroy the police. So all over this country, you hear these people are making a battle cry out of the word police brutality. Anytime a police officer arrests a black man for anything, police brutality, that's all we hear. And meanwhile, these honest citizens, these poor oppressed people that are being brutalized by these terrible cops are plotting to destroy the police. Lock, stock, and barrel. Here is a booklet. This one is not available, by the way. We are printing it. I haven't got it available yet. We just got it. This is a document put out by the Internal Security Subcommittee of the United States Senate with captured communist documents showing black mobs taking over and killing the anti-riot forces of the police force. They're out to get the police. And although I have difficulties with the police, I always cooperate with them, and I find most of them are pretty decent guys trying to... I don't give a damn what you people think. The cops are doing a hell of a good job. They're up against terrific odds. They're not getting paid, and somebody ought to back them up, even if it's only me. But instead of that...
Divide and conquer. Ferguson. What he is talking about then is happening now. And now we've got a president, Muslim president, bringing the Muslims in here and inciting the blacks and the Mexicans, bringing the Mexicans in from Mexico by bus, by plane. They're flying them in. They're doing the same thing he was warning about back in 1967. This was recorded at UCLA, 5/16/1967. I have been telling you this and sharing this information with you for almost 25 years now. I need your support. I need your help. I need you to let people know that I am telling you the same things because I've studied this. I have studied this as George Lincoln Rockwell did. And by the way, he started the American Nazi Party, and he was assassinated just a few weeks after this speech.
What do you find? The communists and most of these Jewish love groups and all these people, these subversive people, attacking your police forces because it's all that stands between you and safety. That's all that protects you from this communist terrorism. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to wind up with the final worldwide picture and try to make it clear enough to you to see why, eventually, what you saw on the screen behind me is going to become a reality, not only in this country, but all over the world, because if it doesn't, you are going to be destroyed. Let me show you a matter of history in a different perspective than you've ever thought of it before. When I got back out of World War II as a fighter pilot, as I told you, I thought that I had finished forever the need for my people and my kids and my country ever again to have to go out and fight another horrible war like that. I couldn't believe that it could ever happen again, such a terrible war. Well, up in China, no sooner than I got home, than in China, a guy rose up by the name of Mao Zedong. Now, some of you young folks are too young to remember this. Mao Zedong rose up in China, and do you know what happened, ladies and gentlemen? All these people went all over the country, these people that believe that there's no communist threat, and we shouldn't believe it. Now listen to this. They told us that Mao Zedong wasn't a communist. He couldn't be a communist. He was an agrarian reformer. Do you know who told us that? Dean Acheson, the president, Walter Lippmann, all the great pundits and geniuses of your country that are now telling you, for instance, that Rockwell is a bigot and a no-good and Welch is an extremist and a crazy man and so forth. All these same people said Mao Zedong is not a communist. In fact, he's the George Washington of China. Dean Rusk, your President Secretary of State, got up at the University of Pennsylvania and made precisely that statement. He said he's not a communist, he's the George Washington of Cuba. Now remember, ladies and gentlemen, this guy that said this is now your Secretary of State. Boy, how wrong can you get? I remember at the time I wasn't even a conservative yet. By that time I was just an ordinary, I think I was a Republican by that time. I'd begun to move a little at a time. So I came back here, and here I am a Republican, and I hear all these leaders of my country saying Mao Zedong is a good guy. There were 26 articles in a row in the Saturday Evening Post, which has been bought by the Zimbalist Jewish family. The Saturday Evening Post printed 26 articles in a row saying Mao Zedong could not be a communist. At the time, ladies and gentlemen, I remember a bunch of nuts and kooks, especially one called Joe McCarthy, and he was saying he is a communist. But of course, Eleanor was saying he couldn't be a communist. And we were being told by everybody else in the country that he couldn't be a communist. So these kooks, I believe, they must be terrible people. There must be something wrong with men that will go around lying about a guy like Mao Zedong, trying to ruin world relations and so forth. So in the name of helping agrarian reform, to help the peasants of Cuba, our government helped put in Mao Zedong. General Marshall went over there and boasted. He says, with a stroke of the pen, I disarmed 20 divisions of the Chinese Nationalist Army. 20 divisions we disarmed. We took all their arms away. Meanwhile, Russia was supplying Japanese arms by the ton and ton after ton to the Chinese communists. Chinese communism took over, and you should have heard Mr. Rusk and all these people be surprised, because no sooner had they taken over, Mao Zedong rose up and said, I'm a communist. I've always been a communist. He murdered 40 million people to thin out the Chinese population a little bit. That's a hell of a way to have an agrarian reform, is to kill all the peasants. That's what he did. Well, now, ladies and gentlemen, you should have heard Eleanor. Oh, she says, what a surprise. How could this be? How could such a thing happen? Who would have thought he could have been a communist? He was absolutely astounded. All these people were amazed. They just couldn't understand it. Well, now, you wouldn't think anybody could be took twice on this deal, would you? And yet, ladies and gentlemen, it happened again. The next thing that happened, now down in Cuba, they had a guy named Batista, and you should have read the propaganda. Some of you folks may remember this deal. Batista was well, let me finish. Mr. Batista was a terrible guy, we were told, because every once in a while, every week or so, he'd kill somebody. He'd actually kill people down there. Of course, he was a Christian and pro-American and anti-communist, but that didn't matter because he was a dirty fascist who killed people. And not only that, but the peasants were oppressed. So in the name of the oppressed peasants, once again, we backed Mr. Castro. Once again, Mr. Lippmann, Eleanor, Dean Rusk, Dean Acheson, everybody told us Castro couldn't be a communist. And by this time, I was a conservative and becoming a Nazi. And by this time, I was beginning to notice his record showed he was a communist. And I was one of the ones saying he is a red. There's his record in Venezuela. He started a communist revolution. Here's the evidence. And yet all these top leaders that are now leading your country were once again wrong, just like they were with Mao Zedong. And they said, no, he's the George Washington of Cuba. So Mr. Castro took over with our help. He was taken to the United States with a triumphal tour all around Disneyland, I think he got. He was put on the Ed Sullivan Show. Ed Sullivan put his arm around him and said he's the George Washington of Cuba for 20 million people. He went right back down to Cuba, and he held a Hate America parade. That was what he called it. He did cast every calumny on this country, and he said, I've always been a communist. And once again, Eleanor was, oh, how could it be? Walter Lippmann was just absolutely appalled. All those guys, Dean Rusk, Dean Acheson, all wrong again, and all us nutty conservatives, haters and bigots, every one of us right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, they're doing it right here in your country to you, and they got many of you helping for the best motives in the world. Get the picture. They always pick an oppressed group. In the name of the oppressed group, they set up these George Washingtons who are going to lead their people out of the land of Egypt into freedom. That's always their cry, freedom. And so, by the way, I might point out, well, I will later point out their war cry. They take this oppressed group, in the name of helping the oppressed group, they set up a communist tyranny. All your leaders tell you they couldn't be communists until finally the day comes when they were wide open as communists, and then all your leaders say, oh, we're surprised. Now here in this country you do have an oppressed group, ladies and gentlemen, but it's not peasants. Remember, in the other countries they call it agrarian reform. China agrarian reform, Cuban agrarian reform. You don't need agrarian reform here because there's not millions of starving peasants. You do have an oppressed group, and it's black. Black people in this country have a rotten lot. Had I been a black man, I'd have been Malcolm X. And I have no respect for these hat-in-hand squirmer-inners and crawl-inners and sit-inners and wee-wee-inners. I have a lot of respect, as much as I'll fight them for Black Panthers and people who want to stand up for black power. I understand Stokely's going to speak here. Well, me and Stokely, sooner or later, are going to face each other over rifles, but at least I respect the man because he stands up for what he believes in. Well, now, anyway, what my point is, the black man has a rotten lot. He is oppressed. So in the name of the oppressed group, they have set up a movement called, not agrarian reform in this country, they call it civil rights. And most of the leaders have read records that long, just like Castro and just like Mao Zedong. But you're told by all the people like are standing up here, why, he couldn't be a communist. He's a preacher. He won the Nobel Prize. How could he be a commie? And I'm telling you his record of red affiliations is that long. I'm telling you that you have it right here on your own soil. You've had 2 strikes, ladies and gentlemen. 1 more and you're out because it's the last country in the world that can stand up to them. They're out to take over this country. I've showed you how they're doing it. I've showed you how they're blacking out so you don't know the information. I finally showed you how they've lied to you at least twice. These same people that are standing up here are people that are telling you now in Vietnam we're just protesting. We're not helping the enemy like hell. When they go out there and do everything they can to get worldwide publicity, the American people are down in the Vietnam War. They are killing Americans, and it's treason, and it ought to be stopped. It ought not to be tolerated another minute. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if we can't get our people woken up, if we can't get it stopped, we are going to lose our country, the greatest and finest country in the history of the world. And the only way I know to stop it is with enlightenment backed up by the guts to stand up to these people and fight them when they need it. And our slogan in doing it, ladies and gentlemen, is that the white people of this country have got to quit being intimidated and divided and conquered. Let me point out, in the Congo, they got a black country, and they won't tolerate a white leader. Let me ask you this. What do you think would happen to a bunch of you white folks that went over to the Congo and started running around hollering, "Get Blackie"? They'd eat you, ladies and gentlemen. But you're supposed to let them do it over here. What I'm getting at is, in this country, the blacks vote black. The Jews vote Jewish. Only the white people are stupid enough to divide themselves and cancel each other out into little Republican and Democrat teams, and you got to cut it out. If they vote black and they vote Jewish, you got to vote white, which is why I preach white power. When you stand together, the majority is supposed to rule in this country, and the majority is white and Christian. And ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to fight to see that we have majority rule in this country. I thank you very much. I thank you very much, and if they'll pass up the questions, I'll try to answer them.
All right.
Please collect the questions from the audience. You have a little slip of paper on your programs to write questions.
He says, pass up the slips of paper so we can get the questions in here. While they're doing it, ladies, while they're collecting the slips, I got something to show.
All right, we're out of time here. But, hey, George Lincoln Rockwell is dead. I'm not. They've tried to kill me too. I'm still here. I need your support. I am standing up for white people, not putting down blacks. Just warning you about it. These groups, color revolutions that's going on all over the world, it's happening here. What Rockwell's talking about is happening right now. It's called Ferguson here. And whites haven't been killed yet, but they are set up for it. And tomorrow I'm going to share with you a speech by the Celtic People's Party of Ireland. I'll be doing that tomorrow. Join me here, but meanwhile, go to freeamerican.com and make a donation. Make a donation. I need your help. I need your help, folks.